April 28th, 1945. 4:10 in the afternoon. The man who'd ruled Italy for 21 years and started a war that destroyed his country stood pressed against a stone wall in a stolen German overcoat. His mistress had thrown her body in front of his to take the bullets. But the man with the gun had a problem. To understand how Italy's most famous man ended up against that wall, we have to back up exactly 3 days. It's April 25th, 1945. Mussolini is sitting in the Archbishop of Milan's palace across from Cardinal Schuster, sweating through a black uniform that doesn't fit him anymore. 61 years old, gut destroyed by ulcers, paranoid out of his mind. He's just been told something that broke him. The Germans, the people who'd kept him alive for 2 years as their puppet leader of northern Italy, are quietly negotiating their surrender to the partisans behind his back. After everything he'd done for Hitler, he was being thrown out like a dirty napkin. He told the cardinal he'd return by 8 that night with an answer. He never came back. Instead, he ran for his life. He grabbed his 33-year-old mistress, Clara Petacci, and fled Milan in a 1939 Alfa Romeo sports car he'd bought her as a gift. He pulled a Luftwaffe overcoat and helmet over his clothes to look like a German anti-aircraft soldier, and joined a convoy of 38 German trucks heading north toward Lake Como. The plan was Switzerland, then a flight to Spain. But hidden inside that convoy was something almost no documentary mentions. An enormous fortune in cash, gold bullion, jewels, and foreign currency, with much of it stripped from European Jews before they were marched into the camps. Italy's most famous dictator wasn't just running for his life, he was running with blood money. And while he was on that road, a partisan leader named Sandro Pertini, who would later become president of Italy, was on Radio Milano Libertà, telling the entire country to find him. And that's where his luck ran out, near a small lakeside town called Dongo, April 27th, 1945. The convoy got stopped at a partisan roadblock manned by the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade. The partisans cut a fast deal with the Germans, let the Germans drive through, but every Italian had to be handed over for inspection. The Germans didn't argue, since they knew the war was over. Mussolini was crouched in the back of one of the trucks, helmet pulled low, head down, trying to disappear. He almost made it, but a partisan named Urbano Lazzaro climbed in for one last sweep and saw a man dressed as a German who looked nothing like a German. The face was just too famous. 20 years of giant murals, propaganda posters, and newsreel footage had made Mussolini's bald head and granite jaw the most recognizable object in Italy. His own cult of personality had finally caught up with him. When they pulled him out, one partisan said his face had gone waxy and his stare was glassy and almost blind. He didn't fight, he didn't argue, he just went quiet. They marched him to the town hall in Dongo and locked him in a back room. Sandro Pertini got back on the radio that night, called Mussolini yellow with rancor and fear, and said the dictator deserved to be killed, like a mangy dog. Clara Petacci wasn't with him at this point. She'd been captured separately, riding in her brother Marcello's car. Marcello tried to bluff his way out of it by claiming he was the Spanish consul on official diplomatic business. Nobody bought it for a second. They put him in a holding cell. But what Clara did next is the part of this story that's hardest to explain. When she found out Mussolini had been captured too, she didn't try to escape and she didn't try to plead her case. She walked up to the partisan commander Bellini delle Stelle and begged him to let her be near Mussolini in his last hours. At 2:30 in the morning on April 28th, Bellini said yes. They drove her up the hill to a peasant farmhouse owned by a family called De Maria in a hamlet called Bonzanigo. She walked into the candlelit room where Mussolini was being held and stayed beside him through the rest of the night. Neither of them knew it yet, but they had less than 14 hours left. But while those two slept their last night together, a very different conversation was happening down in Milan. The Italian resistance had a serious problem on its hands. The British and Americans were rolling north fast, and the Allies wanted Mussolini alive for a very public war crimes trial. The The communists in the resistance didn't want that. They wanted him dead before any Allied soldier could get to him. So a small group met that night, including Sandro Pertini, Leo Valiani, Emilio Sereni, and a senior communist named Luigi Longo. They voted to execute Mussolini without a trial. Longo gave a verbal order to a partisan named Walter Addisio. The exact words, according to Longo himself, were, "Go and shoot him." Addisio was a 34-year-old former accountant who'd taken the war name Colonel Valerio. He liked the spotlight, and he didn't always follow orders carefully. Longo apparently didn't fully trust him with something this big, so he sent another senior partisan, Aldo Lampredi, along with him. Lampredi later said Longo thought Addisio was impudent, too inflexible, and rash. His own bosses sent a babysitter to make sure he didn't screw up the most important execution of the entire 20th century. Addisio and Lampredi drove from Milan to Dongo on the morning of April 28th. They argued for nearly an hour with the local partisan commander, who didn't want to hand Mussolini over without verification. Addisio flashed his orders, took control, and drove up the hill to the De Maria farmhouse, with a small team that included a partisan named Michele Moretti. They picked up Mussolini and Petacci, lied to them about being moved to a safer location, and shoved them into the back of a black car. Mussolini may have actually believed the lie. Some accounts suggest he thought the partisans were taking him somewhere to negotiate his surrender. His mistress was less convinced. She held his hand the entire drive, and then the car pulled up at the gate of a place called Villa Belmonte. It was a quiet residential road in the village of Giulino di Mezzegra, 12 miles south of where they'd been picked up. A low stone wall ran along one side of the property, partially shaded by trees. There were no witnesses, no spectators, no journalists, no cameras. The car stopped, Addisio got out, and he ordered the couple to stand against the wall. He told them they were being executed by order of the Italian resistance. According to one version, Mussolini's last words were, "Aim at my heart." According to a different witness, he just shouted, "No, no," twice. Italy's most famous man, the founder of fascism itself, the self-proclaimed new Caesar, may have spent his final breath offering bribes to a communist accountant. Addisio raised his pistol and pulled the trigger. The pistol jammed in his hand. He pulled out his backup submachine gun and tried again. The submachine gun jammed too. In the most surreal moment of the entire war, the executioner stood there fumbling with two broken weapons, while a dictator and his mistress pressed against a stone wall, waiting to die. Addisio finally turned to Moretti and asked to borrow his Mass 38 submachine gun. Moretti handed it over. Then Clara Petacci did something nobody on that road expected. She stepped in front of Mussolini, threw both arms around him, and screamed at the gunman, "Don't do it!" Addisio had no order to kill her at all. The communists wanted Mussolini dead, and they didn't care about his mistress. But she'd put herself in the line of fire, and Addisio pulled the trigger anyway. 4:10 in the afternoon, April 28th, 1945. The gun fired around 9 bullets in a single burst. 4 of them hit Mussolini in or near the heart. Petacci took 2 9mm rounds to the chest. The strangest detail of all is the one that's never been resolved. The 2 bullets that killed Petacci didn't match the Mass 38 that killed Mussolini. They came from a completely different gun. A 9mm pistol that was never identified, never recovered, and never accounted for in any official report. But it gets worse than that. Over the years, at least 12 different men have been claimed to be the actual person who pulled the trigger. Addisio himself gave at least 22 different versions of his own story before he died in 1971, and they contradict each other on almost every detail. One theory says Mussolini and Petacci were actually shot earlier that morning at the De Maria farmhouse, and the scene at Villa Belmonte was staged with their corpses propped against the wall. Another theory says Sandro Pertini, the future president of Italy, fired the actual rounds himself. Italy still has no official answer. Now, what happened to those bodies next is where this story stops being history and starts being something else entirely. That night, the partisans loaded 18 corpses into the back of a yellow furniture truck. Mussolini, Petacci, 15 executed fascist officials, and Clara's brother, Marcello, who'd been shot in the freezing water of Lake Como while trying to swim away earlier that day. They drove the bodies south through the dark mountain roads, hit one nervous partisan checkpoint after another, and arrived in Milan around 3 in the morning on April 29th. They dumped the 18 bodies in a heap on the wet cobblestones of an open square called Piazzale Loreto. The choice of that exact square was deliberate and personal. 8 months earlier, on August 10th, 1944, the German SS had executed 15 Italian partisans in the same square as a public reprisal, and they'd left the bodies on display for hours to terrify the population. Mussolini heard about it that same week. He'd reportedly said, "For the blood of Piazzale Loreto, we shall pay dearly." His own words from the year before were now being thrown back at his corpse on the same patch of ground. By dawn, word had spread through Milan that the dictator was lying dead in the square. By 9 in the morning, a crowd had gathered. By 10, that crowd had become a mob. By noon, that mob had turned into something an American eyewitness would later describe as sinister, depraved, and out of control. And that's when 20 years of buried rage came out of the people of Milan all at once. The crowd kicked the bodies, they spat on them, they threw rotten vegetables, then they started doing much worse things to the corpse of the man who'd ruined their lives. A man stepped forward and stuffed a dead mouse into Mussolini's slack mouth, chanting, "Make a speech now," over and over to the dead body. Another man kicked him so hard in the jaw that one of his eyes popped out of its socket. Someone cracked his skull open with a blunt object. A woman pushed her way through the crowd carrying a horsewhip and started lashing the body. Another woman pulled out a pistol, walked up to him, and fired 5 shots into his head, screaming that the bullets were for her 5 sons who died in his wars. A third woman walked up, hitched up her skirt, squatted down, and urinated on his face. People were stepping on the bodies, slipping in the blood, trampling the dead fascist officials underfoot. The partisan guards trying to hold the crowd back had to fire rifles into the air just to push them off the corpses. They kept failing every time, and the mob kept surging forward. For Petacci, there was one small mercy in all of it. Her dress had been pulled up around her waist by the rough handling, and she was lying there in the square exposed. A woman in the crowd, who almost certainly wasn't a fascist sympathizer, walked over and tied Clara's skirt around her knees with a piece of cord so she could stay dead with at least some dignity intact. Even at peak mob rage, somebody still cared about a stranger's modesty. Around noon, the partisan commanders made a hard decision. The crowd was now so out of control that the bodies were being torn apart, and they were going to lose the corpses entirely. So they ordered the bodies lifted up and hung by the heels from the steel canopy of an Esso gas station at the edge of the square. The decision was actually practical, even if the famous photographs make it look like the final humiliation. The only way to lift the bodies above arm's reach of the mob was to string them up over the gas pumps. Mussolini, Petacci, and 4 other senior fascists were hung upside down by their ankles in front of the pumps. But the violence didn't end with the executions, the mob, or the gas station. News of what happened in Piazzale Loreto reached Berlin by radio that same day. Adolf Hitler heard the description of the bodies hanging upside down, the urination, the dead mouse, the eye out of its socket, and reportedly went very quiet. He'd been planning his own suicide in the bunker for weeks. Now he had something specific to plan around. He'd die first, and his body would be burned beyond recognition, so no Soviet soldier would ever drag his corpse through Berlin the way Mussolini had been dragged through Milan. Less than 2 days after the Esso photos went out, Hitler shot himself, and his staff burned the body in a shell hole outside the bunker. Mussolini's body went to a Milan morgue for autopsy. He measured 5'6" and weighed 158 pounds, with old bullet wounds, ulcer scars, and almost no actual evidence of the syphilis rumoured about him for decades. The autopsy team did something the Italian government never publicly explained. They kept a piece of his brain and didn't bury it with the rest of him. They handed part of it to American military doctors, who shipped it across the Atlantic to St. Elizabeth's Psychiatric Hospital in Washington, D.C. for study. Italy's former dictator's brain crossed the ocean in a glass jar and stayed in American government hands for 2 decades. He was buried in an unmarked grave in section 16 of Milan's Musocco Cemetery. Plot number 384. No headstone, no name, just dirt and silence. The Italian government wanted him to disappear quietly and be forgotten by history. That didn't go to plan. Because on Easter Sunday in 1946, 3 young neo-fascists walked into that cemetery and stole his body. The leader was a 25-year-old named Domenico Lecisi. He and 2 accomplices dug up Mussolini's grave under cover of darkness on the night of April 23rd. The body had been buried in a shallow grave with poor preparation, and during the exhumation, they accidentally tore one of the legs off the corpse. They washed what was left in a public fountain, loaded it into a wheelbarrow, and pushed it through the empty streets of Milan to a waiting getaway car. They left a handwritten note signed by the so-called Democratic Fascist Party, claiming they'd come to rescue their leader from the insults of human dregs organized in the Communist Party. The body was missing for 4 months. When police finally tracked it down in August 1946 to a Franciscan monastery in Pavia, the Italian government decided they were never going through that mess again. They handed the corpse over to a small group of Capuchin friars in a convent in Cerro Maggiore, and they hid it there in secret for 11 straight years. 3 different Italian governments knew where the body was, but the Italian public didn't. The newspapers didn't even know, and his own widow had no idea where her husband was. It wasn't until 1957 that Prime Minister Adone Zoli, who needed neo-fascist votes in parliament to keep his shaky government alive, cut a quiet political deal. Hand over the body, get the votes in return. Mussolini's remains were transported to his birthplace at Predappio, where his widow Rachele finally buried him in the family crypt. Today, that crypt receives around 70,000 neo-fascist pilgrims a year. And that's where the story should end, but it doesn't, because there's still one secret almost nobody talks about. When the partisans intercepted Mussolini's convoy at Dongo, they captured an enormous fortune. Cash, gold, foreign currency, jewels, valuable paintings. Estimates run into the millions, even in 1945 dollars. Some of it had been looted from murdered European Jews. The treasure officially disappeared after the partisans took it. The strongest theory, supported by partial documents and witness accounts, is that the so-called Dongo treasure was used to fund the post-war Italian Communist Party, which became the largest in Western Europe. The investigations were never resolved. Walter Audicio, the man who pulled the trigger, was rewarded with a seat in the Italian parliament after the war. He died in 1971, still publishing contradictory accounts of what happened that day at Villa Belmonte. The piece of Mussolini's brain kept in Washington, D.C. was finally returned to his family in 1966. In 2009, fragments of his brain tissue and vials of his blood briefly appeared for sale on eBay before Italian authorities had the listing taken down. The wall at Villa Belmonte, where he died, still has the bullet marks in it. If this is the kind of uncensored history you actually want to watch, hit subscribe right now. The textbooks left out the worst of it. On this channel, we don't.